Imagine you are the most powerful kid on your street. For decades, no one can touch you. No one even dares to try. Your strength is your secret. And that secret has kept you safe. Every morning you wake up, that secret is still intact. Every night you sleep, that secret is still protecting you. The neighbors know it, the rivals know it. And because they know it, they stay back. They calculate. They think twice. And you sleep without locking the door, because your reputation is your lock. Now imagine that one day, your closest neighbor, someone who sleeps right next to you, quietly walks into a Chinese weapons factory. He comes back with something that flies 10 times faster than the speed of sound. And the launch pads, the exact spots where that weapon points, are photographed facing your house. You never get a warning. You never get an explanation. You never even get a phone call. You just find out one day, through a satellite image reviewed in a classified briefing room, that the ground beneath your comfort has shifted in a way that cannot be reversed. That is not a movie. That is not a hypothetical scenario for a strategy textbook. That is the Middle East right now in 2025. And that is exactly why Israel is not just concerned. Israel is panicking in a way the world has rarely seen from one of the most disciplined military powers on the planet. This story begins a long time ago, but it explodes into full force right now. And to truly understand why Israel's generals are losing sleep, why the Israeli Air Force is writing emergency position papers, and why a sitting Israeli Prime Minister is calling the American Secretary of State at the first hint of a new arms deal being discussed, you have to go back to a moment that almost no one in the world was paying attention to. A secret deal made in the shadows, a warehouse at somewhere in the Arabian desert, 2 CIA agents with a checklist, and a crate full of Chinese missiles that would quietly, slowly, and permanently begin to change the balance of power in the Middle East forever. In 1988, Saudi Arabia quietly bought its first batch of Chinese ballistic missiles. These were the DF-3s, massive old-school rockets built by China. At the time, the world barely noticed. Saudi Arabia was a close American ally. It was buying Chinese missiles, yes, but nobody panicked. The missiles were big, clunky, and not very accurate. They were more of a symbol than a real weapon. They said, "We exist, we have power, do not push us." Saudi Arabia paraded them publicly in 2014, rolling them through the streets of Riyadh like a message to the whole region, particularly to Iran. The crowds watched. The cameras rolled. The world looked up from its coffee for a moment, then looked away again. Because even then, most analysts said these old Chinese missiles were not a serious military threat. They were political theater. They were noise. They were designed more to impress than to destroy. But the people in Jerusalem were not laughing. Even in 1988, the very idea that Saudi Arabia would form a military relationship with China was something Israel's intelligence community took very seriously. They opened a file, they watched, and they waited for the next move. Then came 2007, and this time it was not noise. According to a bombshell Newsweek investigation confirmed by a well-placed American intelligence source, Saudi Arabia purchased a completely different kind of Chinese missile in 2007. This one was called the DF-21, and this one was not theater. The DF-21, also known in NATO military terminology as the CSS-5, is a 2-stage, solid-fueled, medium-range ballistic missile. The range alone is breathtaking, over 2,000 kilometers. That means it can reach virtually every major city in the Middle East from Saudi soil: Tehran, Baghdad, Beirut, Amman, and yes, Tel Aviv. But the range is not even the most frightening part. The most frightening part is the accuracy. The DF-21 has what military experts call a circular error probability, or CEP, of just 30 meters. Think carefully about what that means. If you fire this missile at a building, it lands within 30 meters of that building. That is not a weapon that misses. That is a weapon that picks a specific target and erases it. That kind of precision puts it in an entirely different category from the old DF-3s. The DF-3s were loud, clumsy, and imprecise. The DF-21 is quiet, fast, and deadly accurate. It is not a weapon you buy to make noise. It is a weapon you buy because you plan to use it, or at the very least, because you want every enemy to believe you will. And the fact that it uses solid fuel changes everything. Older missiles needed to be fueled before launch, a process that could take many hours. During those hours, enemy satellites could see what was happening. Enemy aircraft could scramble. Defensive systems could prepare. The DF-21 uses solid fuel, which means it can be launched in minutes, sometimes seconds, after the order is given. You cannot watch it coming long enough to react. You cannot fully prepare. You cannot intercept it easily because it reaches its target at roughly 10 times the speed of sound. By the time any radar system fully processes what just happened, the missile has already hit. By the time an alert siren sounds, the target is already gone. Now here is where the story gets truly extraordinary. The CIA knew about this deal. Not only did they know, they were part of it. According to Newsweek, Senior CIA officials, including then Associate Deputy Director Michael Morrell and the head of the agency's Intelligence Directorate, were among the very few insiders let in on this secret arrangement. The Bush administration quietly approved the sale, on one condition. Saudi Arabia had to allow CIA technical experts to physically inspect the missiles before taking possession. 2 CIA analysts flew to Saudi Arabia, opened the crates, inspected the weapons with their own hands, and confirmed that the DF-21s were not configured to carry nuclear warheads. They got on the plane, flew home, and told Washington, "These missiles are conventional only. Deal approved." The whole thing was kept completely secret for years. Saudi Arabia never acknowledged it publicly. China never acknowledged it. And Washington stayed silent, treating the entire arrangement as one of the most sensitive secrets in American Middle East policy. But satellite images told a different story, a story that could not be classified or contained. When analysts reviewed photographs of Saudi missile launch facilities, they found something deeply unsettling. The launch pads were oriented, physically pointing, in specific directions. One direction was clearly toward Iran, the other direction pointed toward Israel. Both targets were within the DF-21's operational range. Both were within striking distance. Both were real. When those satellite images became known inside Israeli defense circles, the reaction was immediate, serious, and lasting. Because even if Saudi Arabia had absolutely no intention of ever firing at Israel, the capability was there, the geometry was there, the math was there. And in the world of military strategy, capability is the only thing that matters in the long run. Intentions can change overnight. Political alliances can reverse in a month. Governments can fall. New leaders can rise with completely different worldviews and completely different enemies. Capabilities, on the other hand, do not disappear. A missile buried in a reinforced underground bunker does not go away when a king dies or a prime minister changes his mind. It stays there. It waits. It remains ready. And it will be ready for whoever comes next. Jeffrey Lewis, the director of the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, explained this with striking clarity. He said the DF-21s would be most useful against high-value targets. He specifically mentioned presidential palaces and supreme leader facilities in Tehran as the primary intended targets. But the missile does not care who built it or why it was originally purchased. If the political situation ever changes, if alliances shift, if a new government comes to power, if a regional crisis spirals beyond anyone's control, the missile does what it was designed to do. It flies. It hits. And what it hits depends entirely on who is giving the orders at that particular moment in history. Now let us talk about China's role in all of this, because this is where the story gets significantly deeper and significantly more dangerous for Israel. China did not just sell Saudi Arabia a few old missiles and walk away. China has been building a long-term military relationship with Saudi Arabia, one that has grown dramatically over the past decade, and one that has accelerated sharply in very recent years. China has been providing Saudi Arabia with solid rocket fuel technology, actively helping the kingdom develop its own domestic weapons manufacturing capacity. This is not just a buyer-seller relationship. This is a technology transfer. This is China teaching Saudi Arabia how to build weapons, not just how to use them. China has also sold Saudi Arabia advanced drone systems, including the Loong 2 and the CH-4, medium-endurance combat drones that give Saudi Arabia the ability to strike targets far beyond its borders without risking a single pilot. These are not toy drones. These are military-grade, weaponized, unmanned aircraft that have already been used in live conflicts across the region and in Africa. Saudi Arabia has used them. They work. And Saudi Arabia is buying more of them every year. And here is the critical point that connects all of this together, the point that truly explains Israel's full panic. It is not just that Saudi Arabia has Chinese missiles. It is that Saudi Arabia now has deep structural institutional connections to China's entire defense apparatus. Chinese engineers work directly on Saudi weapon systems. Chinese companies have built critical infrastructure across the kingdom. Huawei, the Chinese technology giant that the United States has officially described as a national security threat, has built a significant portion of Saudi Arabia's 5G telecommunications network. That means Chinese presence is embedded not just in Saudi Arabia's missiles, but in Saudi Arabia's communication systems, its data networks, and its digital intelligence infrastructure. For Israel and for the United States, this is not a small concern to be managed quietly. This is a fundamental strategic problem. Because here is what happens when you mix Chinese military technology, Chinese communications infrastructure, and American stealth fighter jets in the same country. You create a situation where China potentially has eyes and ears inside one of America's most important military partners in the entire Middle East. In November 2025, that theoretical risk became a crisis-level reality. U.S. President Donald Trump sat down with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman at the White House. During that meeting, Trump confirmed something that sent immediate shockwaves through Jerusalem. He announced that the United States would sell Saudi Arabia up to 48 F-35 stealth fighter jets, the same aircraft that Israel currently uses, and currently uses exclusively in the entire Middle East. This was not just a headline. This was a thunderclap that echoed through every military intelligence office in Israel. Because the F-35 is not just a plane, the F-35 is Israel's single most important military advantage, the crown jewel of its entire defense posture. To understand why, you need to understand what the F-35 actually is. This aircraft runs on more than 25 million lines of computer code. That is more than 10 times the software in Israel's older fighter platforms. It has stealth technology that makes it nearly invisible to most radar systems in operation today. It can detect, identify, and engage multiple threats simultaneously from distances that older aircraft cannot even see. Israel has used the F-35, which they call the Adr, meaning the mighty one, in some of the most significant military operations in recent history. Israeli F-35s struck Iran's air defenses in June 2025, flying deep into Iranian territory without permission, hitting their targets, and returning home completely undetected. They operate freely in Syrian airspace. They struck Houthi infrastructure in Yemen. In every single case, the F-35 did what no other aircraft in the region could do. It went where it wanted, hit what it wanted, and came back. No other country in the Middle East had this capability. Israel was alone in that club, and that exclusivity was not an accident. It was the result of decades of careful U.S.-Israeli military coordination designed to keep Israel ahead. Since 2008, a U.S. law, passed specifically by Congress and signed into federal statute, has required the President of the United States to ensure that any arms sale to countries in the Middle East does not damage Israel's qualitative military edge. The QME is not just a political promise between friends made over a handshake. It is a binding legal obligation embedded in American federal law. It means Israel must always maintain a decisive technological and operational advantage over any realistic combination of regional forces that could threaten its existence or its security. The QME is the reason Israel received the F-35 before any other country in the region. The QME is the specific reason Turkey was kicked entirely out of the F-35 program when it purchased Russian S-400 air defense systems, because mixing Russian systems with American jets created an unacceptable intelligence risk. The QME is the reason the United Arab Emirates received a scaled-back arms package after its own F-35 discussions ultimately collapsed. And the QME is now being tested more severely, more publicly, and more urgently than at any point in its entire history, by a $142 billion deal by Saudi Arabia that sits at the intersection of American and Chinese military relationships, and by a political moment in Washington where financial and diplomatic interests are being weighed against long-standing security commitments in real time. He called U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who walked back Trump's statement and promised publicly that the QME would remain fully intact. But here's the thing that nobody should miss. Netanyahu had to make that call. That phone call, that anxious scramble for reassurance, tells you everything about how serious this moment actually was. The Israeli Air Force submitted a formal written position paper to Israel's political leadership, warning in clear terms that the country's air superiority in the region could be permanently and irreversibly damaged if Saudi Arabia received comparable F-35 capability. The Israeli military was not sending polite memos. They were sounding emergency alarms. Eric Mandel, the senior security editor of the Jerusalem Report and director of the Middle East Political Information Network, was direct about it. He said that even a slightly downgraded fifth-generation F-35 in Saudi hands would be a strategic game-changer for the entire region. He said the Israeli Air Force, alongside senior U.S. intelligence and defense officials, believe such a sale would fundamentally undermine Israel's military dominance and its ability to control regional airspace, the one domain where Israel has been completely unchallenged. That is not the opinion of one worried commentator. That is a consensus view inside some of the most serious defense and intelligence institutions in the world. Josef Kuperwasser, the director of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, explained the deeper logic of Israel's qualitative military edge with striking and almost painful clarity. He said, Israel has no chance of ever matching its opponents in sheer numbers. Israel is a small country surrounded by much larger ones. It cannot build armies the size of Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, or Turkey. The only way Israel has survived and thrived, and even grown stronger, while surrounded by much larger, more numerous opponents, is by being significantly more advanced in every measurable way. Better trained, better equipped, better technology, better intelligence. Remove that technological gap, even partially, and the entire equation that has kept Israel safe for 70 years changes dramatically. As Kuperwasser put it directly, normalization can be taken back with a phone call, but the F-35s will be there forever. Now let us zoom out and look at the full picture of what Saudi Arabia's military is becoming, because it is far larger and far more dramatic than most people outside defense circles realize. The kingdom is not just buying missiles and fighter jets. Saudi Arabia is on a full-scale, top-to-bottom military transformation unlike anything the region has ever witnessed. In May 2025, the Trump administration signed the largest single defense cooperation agreement in American history, a package worth $142 billion with Saudi Arabia. $142 billion. Say that number slowly and let it sit for a moment. That is not a transaction between allies. That is a complete rebuilding of a nation's military capacity from the desert floor upward. Saudi Arabia is buying new Hellfire missiles, 2,500, 3 of them signed for in October 2024 alone. It is seeking 48 F-35s worth tens of billions on their own. It is in advanced discussions to purchase up to 200 collaborative combat aircraft and 130 armed MQ-9B drones, some of the most effective unmanned strike systems in the American military inventory. These are not defensive purchases. These are not weapons bought to sit on a shelf. These are the weapons of a country that is building a military capable of projecting serious force across a very wide region. And Saudi Arabia is simultaneously building its own domestic defense industry, with Chinese technical assistance playing a significant and deeply worrying role in that process. The kingdom is not just a buyer of weapons anymore, it is becoming a builder of weapons. And that changes the long-term strategic picture in ways that no arms deal paperwork and no diplomatic assurance can fully contain or control. And there is one more dimension to this story that cannot and must not be ignored. The nuclear shadow. Saudi Arabia's Chinese missiles were sold with conventional warheads. That is what the CIA confirmed during its on-site inspection back in 2007. But here is the uncomfortable truth that every serious defense analyst carries with them. The DF-21 was designed by China specifically to carry both conventional and nuclear warheads. The 2 versions of the missile look nearly identical from the outside. Removing the nuclear components from the missiles that were delivered to Saudi Arabia does not permanently remove the nuclear potential embedded in the relationship between Riyadh and Beijing. It does not eliminate the know-how. It does not eliminate the infrastructure. And it does not eliminate Saudi Arabia's declared ambition to match whatever nuclear capability its enemies acquire. Saudi Arabia has been completely transparent about one thing. If Iran ever achieves a nuclear weapon, Saudi Arabia will seek one too. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman said this on record in a televised interview in 2018. He said simply and without hesitation, if Iran gets a nuclear bomb, Saudi Arabia will get one. That is not a casual threat thrown out in a moment of frustration. That is a declared national policy from the most powerful man in the kingdom. And Saudi Arabia already has a working relationship with Pakistan, one of the world's confirmed nuclear-armed states. When Saudi Arabia paraded its Chinese missiles in 2014, it invited Pakistan's top military commander as a guest of honor at the ceremony. That single gesture, that one invitation, sent immediate and serious alarms through every major intelligence service in the region, because it raised an obvious question that no one has been able to definitively answer. Is Saudi Arabia seeking to acquire, or at minimum have on-call access to, Pakistani nuclear warheads that could be loaded onto those Chinese DF-21 missiles already sitting in Saudi underground bunkers? Saudi Arabia reportedly helped finance Pakistan's nuclear weapons program decades ago. And while no formal nuclear sharing arrangement has ever been officially confirmed, the strategic relationship between Riyadh and Islamabad in the nuclear dimension remains one of the most carefully watched and most dangerous open questions in global non-proliferation policy. For Israel, the possibility, even the theoretical not yet confirmed possibility, that the same DF-21 missiles currently buried in Saudi desert facilities could one day be fitted with Pakistani nuclear warheads is not something any government in Jerusalem can dismiss, ignore, or file away as unlikely. So now let us tie all of this together, because this is where the full and crushing weight of Israel's panic becomes completely understandable. You have a country, Saudi Arabia, that has been quietly arming itself with Chinese ballistic missiles for nearly 4 decades. Those missiles are accurate, fast, solid-fueled, and already deployed in hardened underground facilities, with satellite-photographed launch pads pointing toward Israel. That same country then builds deep institutional ties with China, ties that include drone technology, rocket fuel systems, 5G telecommunications, infrastructure built by Huawei, and active military technical assistance from Chinese engineers on Saudi soil. That same country then becomes the target of the largest American defense deal in all of recorded history, $142 billion, and immediately lobbies for and receives approval to purchase America's most advanced stealth fighter jet. That country has never officially recognized Israel. That country sits geographically in a position where its most advanced weapon systems can reach Israeli cities. And that country is surrounded by other regional powers, Iran, Turkey, Qatar, Pakistan, all of whom are watching this transformation very carefully and drawing their own conclusions about what moves to make next. Israel watched every single step of this progression. And at some point, watching became impossible to do calmly. At some point, the calculations stopped adding up to anything reassuring. In November 2025, when Trump publicly said Saudi Arabia should receive F-35s comparable to Israel's, the Israeli Air Force did not simply raise a polite objection. They submitted a formal military position paper. The IDF officially opposed the sale. Israel's government scrambled urgently to call Washington. Netanyahu personally called Rubio. State Department officials traveled to Jerusalem for emergency consultations. U.S. military officials held closed-door sessions on Capitol Hill. The Trump administration publicly announced it was reviewing the entire framework of Israel's qualitative military edge, something that had not been openly revisited in memory. Multiple U.S. officials, current and former, spoke to journalists on background to express genuine alarm about what it would mean for America's most advanced stealth technology to land inside a country where Chinese engineers and Chinese intelligence infrastructure are already deeply embedded. This was not political theater. This was a genuine strategic crisis. This was the moment when decades of carefully constructed security architecture, designed to keep Israel safe, to protect American weapons technology from Chinese access, and to prevent the Middle East from cascading into an uncontrolled and destabilizing arms race, all came under simultaneous and overwhelming pressure from the same direction at the same time. And the deepest irony, the part that makes this story truly historic, is that Saudi Arabia is not an enemy of Israel. Not officially, not today. In recent years, there has been significant quiet cooperation between Riyadh and Jerusalem. They share intelligence on Iran. They share strategic interest in keeping Tehran from dominating the region. There are back channels that both governments use regularly. In many ways, Israel and Saudi Arabia are closer right now than they have been at any point in history. And yet the very nature of missiles and fighter jets and nuclear-capable delivery systems is that they outlast friendships. They survive governments. They survive the death of kings. A weapon sold today will still exist 20 years from now, and nobody in the world can guarantee what 20 years will bring to the Middle East. That is the calculation Israel is making every single day. That is what keeps Israeli generals awake long after midnight. Not that Saudi Arabia is pointing those weapons at Israel today, but that the weapons Saudi Arabia is building and buying and developing, the Chinese DF-21 missiles already sitting in those desert bunkers, the American F-35s soon to be on Saudi runways, the Chinese drones already flying in Saudi airspace, the Chinese telecommunications infrastructure woven through Saudi networks. Those weapons and those systems will still be there in 2035, in 2040, in 2050. And nobody alive today knows what the map of alliances, governments, and conflicts in the Middle East will look like at any of those moments. Joseph Cooperwasser said it most clearly and most painfully. He said, normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, the diplomatic breakthrough that both sides have been slowly and carefully working toward for years, can be reversed with a single phone call from a new government, a new king, or a new crisis. Reversing normalization costs nothing and takes nothing more than a decision. But the DF-21 missiles buried in those reinforced Saudi underground facilities and the F-35 stealth jets that will one day sit on those Saudi runways cannot be undelivered. They cannot be taken back once they are given. Once a country has a weapon of that range, that accuracy, and that speed, it has it permanently and unconditionally. The decision to allow that country to have it was made in a conference room, at a polished table, in a moment of political calculation and economic interest that may look very different in hindsight than it looks today. History always judges these decisions later, and history is not always kind. Israel is a country that has survived against extraordinary odds for nearly 80 years because of one principle above everything else. It must always be more powerful, more precise, and more capable than any realistic combination of forces that could threaten its existence. That principle has a name. It is called the qualitative military edge. And for the first time in a very long time, that edge feels as though it is being quietly negotiated away. Not by enemies storming through the gates, but by deals being made between allies in rooms Israel was not invited into, over weapons that will outlast every political promise being made about how they will never be used. Saudi Arabia's Chinese missiles were always there. The DF-21s, sitting in their underground bunkers since 2007, were always pointed in the direction of both Iran and Israel. For years, Israel could look at those missiles and say, we have technology those weapons cannot match. We have stealth. We have precision. We have speed. We have intelligence. We have the most advanced air force operating in this region by a significant margin. We have our edge. But in this current moment, when China is deeper inside Saudi Arabia than it has ever been before, when a $142 billion arms deal is reshaping the Saudi military from the desert floor upward, when American F-35 stealth technology is being offered to a country that already flies Chinese drones, houses Chinese missiles, and runs Chinese telecommunications infrastructure, that old reassurance is harder to find. That confidence is harder to hold on to. This is why Israel is panicking. not because Saudi Arabia fired a shot, not because any single red line was crossed on a single dramatic day. Israel is panicking because the architecture of its safety, the careful, decades-long construction of an unassailable technological superiority, is being quietly and systematically dismantled. Not in a single earthquake, but in a series of smaller tremors. Each tremor seems survivable on its own. Each deal seems justifiable when viewed in isolation. Each missile purchase and each jet contract and each Chinese telecommunications agreement seems manageable when considered alone. But together, added up, seen as a single integrated picture, they describe a Middle East that is moving steadily and perhaps irreversibly away from the one where Israel's survival formula has always worked. They describe a region where the rules that kept the peace are being quietly rewritten by money, by geopolitics, and by the relentless logic of a global competition between the United States and China that is playing out, in real time, on Saudi Arabian soil. The most powerful kid on the street is still standing. He still has advantages. He still has allies. He still has capabilities that no other country in the region can fully match. But the street is changing around him faster than at any point in recent memory. New weapons are arriving, new relationships are forming, new calculations are being made in rooms he cannot enter by people whose long-term intentions he cannot be fully certain of. And the weapons that were always pointed at him. Even if nobody ever intended to use them today, even if they were purchased for entirely different reasons, even if they sit quietly in those bunkers for years without being touched, have not gone anywhere. They are still there. They are getting more advanced every single year. They are being maintained, upgraded, and kept ready. And now, for the first time in history, some of the very people who were supposed to be his closest protectors are handing his neighbor some of the same tools he has always relied on to stay alive and to stay free. That is why Israel is watching every move. That is why every deal is analyzed, every satellite image is reviewed, every diplomatic signal is decoded and debated. That is why Israeli generals write emergency position papers and intelligence agencies send classified warnings and prime ministers pick up the phone at midnight when the first rumor of a new arms deal reaches Jerusalem. Because in the Middle East, history has delivered exactly the same brutal and permanent lesson to every nation that has ever tried to survive in it. The moment you stop being the most capable force in the room is the moment everything becomes unpredictable. And unpredictable, in a region full of Chinese ballistic missiles, stealth fighter jets, nuclear shadows, and rivalries that stretch back centuries, is the most dangerous and most irreversible condition in the world.